In the windswept plains of Nebraska, where endless cornfields stretched toward distant horizons, lived a man whose kindness would reshape the destiny of an entire community. Thomas McKenna had spent 43 years working the same patch of earth his grandfather had claimed during the homestead era. His weathered hands told stories of countless seasons, each line etched by years of planting hope and harvesting dreams. The small farmhouse where he lived alone creaked with memories of a family long gone. But Thomas never complained about his solitude. He found peace in the rhythm of farm life, rising with the sun and resting when darkness claimed the fields. On this particular autumn morning, frost painted delicate patterns across his windows as Thomas prepared for what he believed would be just another ordinary day. Little did he know that within hours, a chance encounter would trigger a chain of events so extraordinary that the story would be whispered in hushed tones throughout Kansas, Nebraska, and beyond. The golden sunrise cast long shadows across his property, and somewhere in the distance, destiny was already setting its wheels in motion. As Thomas stepped onto his front porch with his morning coffee, he noticed something unusual near the old oak tree that marked the edge of his property. A small figure huddled against the massive trunk, barely visible in the early morning light. Moving closer, his heart nearly stopped when he realized it was a young girl, no more than 8 years old, with tangled brown hair and clothes that had seen better days. Her lips were blue from the cold, and her small body shook uncontrollably. Thomas immediately recognized the signs of severe hunger and exposure. The child's eyes, though weak, held a fierce determination that reminded him of his own daughter, Sarah, who had passed away from illness 15 years earlier. Without hesitation, he scooped the girl into his arms and carried her toward the warmth of his home. Her weight felt like nothing more than a bundle of fragile bones, and Thomas realized just how close to death she truly was. Inside the farmhouse, he wrapped her in his warmest blanket and began preparing a simple meal of bread and milk. The girl, who could barely speak above a whisper, told him her name was Emma. She had been traveling with her family when their wagon broke down 3 days earlier. Her parents had gone to seek help in the nearest town but never returned. Emma had waited and waited, surviving on nothing but rainwater and wild berries, before finally collapsing from exhaustion near Thomas's property. As she spoke, tears rolled down her hollow cheeks, and Thomas felt his heart breaking for this lost child. He knew that the nearest town, Millfield, was almost 50 miles away through dangerous territory. Winter was approaching fast, and the roads were already becoming treacherous. Taking Emma there immediately would be risky, especially given her weakened condition. Thomas decided she needed at least a few days to recover her strength before attempting the journey. During those days, something magical happened within the walls of the old farmhouse. Emma's laughter began to fill the empty spaces that had been silent for so long. Thomas found himself humming old songs while he cooked, and for the first time in years, he set 2 places at the dinner table. As Emma's health improved, Thomas noticed something peculiar about the child. She possessed an unusual knowledge of farming techniques that seemed far beyond her years. When he mentioned struggling with a particular section of his field that never seemed to produce healthy crops, Emma suggested a crop rotation method that Thomas had never heard of but seemed remarkably sophisticated. Even more intriguing were the stories she told about her family. They weren't just ordinary travelers, she explained, but part of a community that had been searching for a new place to call home. Her father, she said, was a leader among their people, and they possessed skills and knowledge that could benefit any community willing to accept them. On the 3rd evening, as they sat by the fireplace sharing stories, Emma noticed the small wooden box on Thomas's mantelpiece. Inside, she could see the glint of something golden. When she asked about it, Thomas's expression grew solemn. He explained that it contained his most precious possession, a gold coin that had been passed down through 3 generations of McKennas. His great-grandfather had received it as payment for helping to establish the first railroad depot in the county. The coin represented not just monetary value, but the entire history and legacy of his family. Thomas had always planned to leave it to Sarah, but after her death, he had simply kept it as a reminder of his family's proud heritage. Emma listened to the story with wide-eyed fascination, understanding that she was hearing about something truly important. That night, as Thomas tucked her into the small bed he had prepared in Sarah's old room, Emma made an unexpected request. She asked if she could hold the gold coin, just for a moment. Something in her innocent voice moved Thomas deeply. He retrieved the wooden box and carefully placed the coin in her small hands. Emma closed her eyes and held the coin against her heart for several minutes, as if drawing strength from its presence. When she handed it back, she looked at Thomas with an expression of profound gratitude and said something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. She told him that true treasures were meant to be shared, and that generosity always returned to those who practiced it. The next morning brought alarming news. Emma's condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse during the night. She was burning with fever and could barely keep food down. Thomas realized that she needed medical attention immediately, but the nearest doctor was in Millfield, and the journey would take at least 2 days by wagon. As he paced frantically around his kitchen, trying to decide what to do, Emma called him to her bedside. In a voice barely above a whisper, she told him that she was dying and that there was something important she needed him to know. Her family wasn't lost or abandoned, she explained. They were camped in the hills about 20 miles north, waiting for her to return with news about whether this area would be suitable for settlement. Emma revealed that her people possessed healing knowledge that could save her life, but she was too weak to make the journey alone. She begged Thomas to take her to them, explaining that they would reward his kindness beyond his wildest dreams. However, the journey would be dangerous, and Thomas would have to trust strangers he had never met. As he wrestled with this decision, Emma made one final, heartbreaking request. She asked Thomas to give her the gold coin, not as payment or trade, but as a symbol of the bond they had formed. She promised that if she survived, the coin would be returned to him along with something far more valuable than gold. Thomas stood at a crossroads that would define the rest of his life. Every practical instinct told him to take Emma to the doctor in Millfield, where she could receive proper medical care. But something in her desperate eyes convinced him that her family truly possessed the knowledge to save her. Against all logic, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He placed the precious gold coin in Emma's weak hands and began preparing for the most important journey of his life. As he loaded supplies into his wagon, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far greater than a simple rescue mission. The journey northward proved more treacherous than Thomas had anticipated. The autumn storms had turned the rough trails into muddy quagmires, and Emma's condition continued to deteriorate with each passing mile. Several times, Thomas considered turning back, but each time Emma would squeeze his hand and whisper words of encouragement that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her fading strength. On the second day, just when Thomas was beginning to fear that they were lost, they crested a hill and saw something that took his breath away. Spread across the valley below was a camp unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Dozens of sturdy tents were arranged in perfect circles, and the organized activity throughout the settlement spoke of a highly disciplined and capable community. As their wagon approached the camp, Thomas was amazed by what he observed. The people moving about the settlement were clearly skilled craftsmen, warriors, and leaders. Their clothing and equipment spoke of prosperity and organization, yet they had chosen to live in temporary shelters rather than established towns. When Emma's arrival was announced, the entire camp seemed to spring into coordinated action. Within minutes, she was surrounded by healers who began administering treatments that Thomas had never seen before. Herbs were burned, strange chants were spoken, and Emma was given liquids that seemed to immediately begin restoring her strength. The efficiency and knowledge displayed by these people convinced Thomas that Emma's claims about her family's abilities were completely true. As Emma received treatment, Thomas found himself surrounded by men and women who treated him with a respect that seemed almost ceremonial. An elderly man with piercing blue eyes and graying hair approached Thomas and introduced himself as Marcus, Emma's grandfather and the leader of their community. Marcus explained that they were the descendants of a group that had left the eastern settlements decades earlier, seeking a place where they could live according to their own traditions and values. They possessed knowledge and skills that had been passed down through generations, including advanced techniques in agriculture, metalworking, healing, and warfare. For years, they had been searching for the right location to establish a permanent settlement, sending scouts ahead to evaluate different regions. Emma, despite her young age, was one of their most gifted scouts. She possessed an unusual ability to read the land and evaluate the character of the people who lived there. Her mission had been to spend time in the farming communities around this area, assessing whether the local population would be welcoming to newcomers. Her encounter with Thomas had been no accident, Marcus explained. She had been watching his farm for days, evaluating his character and trying to determine whether he represented the kind of neighbor they hoped to find. When she had deliberately allowed herself to be found in a desperate condition, it had been a test of Thomas's fundamental nature. His response had exceeded all their expectations. Marcus revealed that Emma had sent word to the camp each night, using methods that Thomas couldn't understand, reporting on his kindness, generosity, and character. The decision to ask for the gold coin had been the final test. By giving away his most precious possession to a dying child, Thomas had proven that he possessed the qualities they valued most highly. As Marcus spoke, Thomas began to understand that he had been part of an elaborate evaluation process, but rather than feeling manipulated, he found himself impressed by the sophistication and wisdom of these people. Their methods might have been unusual, but their values aligned perfectly with his own beliefs about how people should treat one another. Emma's recovery progressed rapidly under the care of her people's healers, and within hours, she was sitting up and speaking normally. When she saw Thomas, her face lit up with joy, and she immediately reached for the gold coin she had been clutching throughout her illness. But instead of simply returning it, Emma asked Thomas to follow her to a large tent at the center of the camp. Inside, Thomas discovered something that left him speechless. Arranged on tables and shelves were examples of the finest craftsmanship he had ever seen. Tools, weapons, jewelry, and artwork that surpassed anything produced in the established towns and cities of the region. Emma explained that this was just a small sample of what her people could create when they had access to proper workshops and materials. Marcus stepped forward and made an offer that would change Thomas's life forever. The community had decided that Thomas's land would be perfect for their permanent settlement, and they wanted to establish their new town in partnership with him. Rather than simply buying his property or pushing him out, they proposed something unprecedented. Thomas would become a founding member of their community, with full rights and privileges. His farming expertise would be valued and expanded through their advanced agricultural techniques. In return for his generosity toward Emma, they would share their knowledge and skills with him, making his farm more productive than he had ever imagined possible. The gold coin, which had served as the catalyst for this entire chain of events, would be melted down and incorporated into the foundation stone of their new town hall, ensuring that Thomas's generosity would be remembered for generations. But Marcus had saved the most surprising revelation for last. The community numbered not dozens, but hundreds of people. The camp Thomas saw represented only the advance party. Hidden in the surrounding hills were nearly 400 skilled warriors, craftsmen, farmers, and leaders, all waiting for word that a suitable location had been found. Emma's mission had been to evaluate not just the land, but the character of the existing population. Thomas's actions had convinced them that this region contained the kind of people they wanted as neighbors and partners. If Thomas agreed to their proposal, the entire community would relocate to the area, bringing skills, knowledge, and prosperity that would benefit everyone in the surrounding counties. Thomas found himself overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. In the span of a few days, he had gone from being a lonely farmer facing an uncertain future to being invited to join a thriving community that valued his contributions and wanted him as a partner. The loneliness that had defined his existence for so many years suddenly seemed like a distant memory. These people didn't just want to use his land. They wanted to include him in their family. Emma, who had recovered completely from her illness, took Thomas's hand and made one final, surprising revelation. She wasn't just a scout for her people. She was Marcus's granddaughter and had been designated as his successor. By saving her life and proving his character, Thomas had unknowingly formed a bond with the future leader of the entire community. The decision Thomas faced was both simple and monumentally complex. He could return to his solitary life on the farm, keeping his gold coin and his familiar routines, or he could join these remarkable people in building something entirely new. As he looked around the camp, Seeing the hope and excitement in hundreds of faces, Thomas realized that the choice had already been made the moment he decided to help a starving child. The following morning, Thomas rode back to his farm with a small delegation from the community. By afternoon, nearly 400 people had emerged from the hills and valleys where they had been patiently waiting. The sight of so many skilled and capable individuals working together to establish a new settlement was unlike anything the region had ever seen. Within weeks, the area around Thomas's farm had been transformed into a bustling community. Advanced agricultural techniques tripled his crop yields. Workshops sprang up producing goods of exceptional quality. A school was established where traditional knowledge was passed down to a new generation. The gold coin that Thomas had given to Emma was indeed melted down and incorporated into the foundation of the town hall, but not before being replicated in dozens of copies that were given to community leaders as symbols of the values they all shared. Thomas discovered that his act of generosity had not just saved one child's life. It had provided a new home for hundreds of people and established a community that would prosper for generations. The transformation extended far beyond Thomas's property. Neighboring farms began adopting the agricultural techniques shared by the newcomers. Trade relationships developed with distant cities, bringing prosperity to the entire region. The skills and knowledge that the community brought with them elevated the standard of living for everyone in the area. Thomas, who had been designated as an honorary elder despite being younger than most of the community's leaders, found himself busier and happier than he had ever been. The empty rooms of his farmhouse were filled with guests, apprentices, and friends. The silence that had once defined his existence was replaced by the sounds of a thriving community. Years later, when travelers passed through the region, they would often comment on the unusual prosperity and harmony they observed. The story of the lonely farmer who gave his only gold coin to a starving girl would be told and retold, growing in the telling but never losing its essential truth. Thomas McKenna had discovered that generosity, when offered without expectation of reward, could create miracles that exceeded the wildest imagination. The gold coin that had represented his family's history had been transformed into something far more valuable: the foundation of a community built on principles of kindness, mutual respect, and shared prosperity. Emma grew up to become exactly the leader that Marcus had predicted, guiding the community with wisdom beyond her years, and never forgetting the lesson she had learned from Thomas about the power of selfless generosity. The town they built together became a model for other communities throughout the region, proving that people from different backgrounds could work together to create something better than any of them could have achieved alone. Thomas lived to see his adopted home become one of the most prosperous and admired communities in the entire state, knowing that it had all begun with a simple decision to help a child in need. The legacy of that autumn morning when Thomas found Emma by the old oak tree extended far beyond the boundaries of their community. The story inspired similar acts of generosity throughout the region, creating a culture of mutual support and cooperation that lasted for generations. Thomas's willingness to give up his most precious possession to save a stranger's life had demonstrated that true wealth lay not in what people accumulated, but in what they were willing to share. The 400 people who had called him father had done so not because of blood relationships, but because he had shown them the kind of character they wanted to emulate and pass on to their children.